Good evening, or good morning, or good afternoon, depending on where in the world you're joining us from online. Welcome to Reading Architecture Writing, a lecture series at Kyoto University in which authors will introduce their new books or their new ongoing book projects, usually but not always related to Japanese architecture and urbanism. So it's a great pleasure to introduce tonight the American architect Ari Seligmann. He's currently an associate professor and the associate dean for education at the Art, Design and Architecture faculty in the University of Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. He did his PhD at UCLA, but he has experience as a practicing architect, notably for Itsuko Hasegawa in Tokyo. He's also a critic, a historian, and a designer, engaged in studies of contemporary architecture and urbanism, particularly Japanese architecture, with a special interest in the relationships between architecture and other media. He's widely published in various books. He's written chapters for a book titled Studio Futures, for Semi-Detached Writing, Representation and Criticism in Architecture, and for Curating Architecture in the City. And I should mention for my own book, After the Crash, Architecture in Post-Bubble Japan. He's also widely published in various prestigious journals, notably the Journal of the Society of Architectural Historians and the Journal of Architecture Education. His previous book, Japanese Modern Architecture, 1920 until 2015, Developments and Dialogues, which was published in 2016, is the, well, let's say the first comprehensive English language survey of modern Japanese architecture produced in almost 30 years. Now, his current research also examines Japanese architectural photography, or I should say photography of Japanese architecture. So today he's going to consider what he calls the discursive constructions of Japanese architecture, drawing threads from his previous book and tying them into his current research. He wants to examine the photographic construction of Japanese architecture by examining key photographers, by examining the evolution of architectural photography in Japan in terms of technique and approach. This is intended to broaden an international understanding of Japanese architectural production in terms of those responsible for framing architecture developments and how their particular framing shapes the reception of the images of the architecture. So it's a hybrid historical and historiographic study. It will investigate the roles of photography while also shedding light on the photographers themselves, and also shedding light on the processes and agents that are involved in the production of photographs and how they are consumed by the global audience. So this all should provoke consideration of how images shape our readings and understandings and imaginings and interpretations of Japanese architecture in general. So given the emphasis on photographs, I'm sure we can expect a visually provocative and fascinating presentation. Over to you, Ari.
So thank you for coming. Again, I'm going to present in English in order to, it's my native language, but I've used some Japanese captions to help facilitate reception of things. And as Tom mentioned, I'm trained as an architect, also an architectural historian and a critic, and most interested in issues of historiography across discourses, images, and imagination of Japanese architecture. So, for example, in some previous papers, I've looked at various different kinds of discourses that have been used to explain Japanese architecture, ranging from tropes of tradition to dichotomies between simplicity and ornamentation, to notions of pluralism and new wave that were used in the 70s as a kind of post-metabolist alternative to notions of postmodernism. So ways Japanese architecture has been written about and understood. So, for example, in the 1970s, Japanese architecture was explained in English through notions of pluralism, beginning with Jenks's essay published in 1980, and then trickling with, but the initial Jenks essay from 80 was originally written in 1976, and then published again in English in 1980, but it had a lot of influence then on the post-metabolism issue of JA and on the new wave of Japanese architects exhibition, and then trickled through to other variations of new wave and pluralism. And so you can track through the various, through these discourses, the various kinds of projects and the various repeating categories that were used to try to explain things, just as one example of a kind of trying to understand the networks of discourses. Obviously, I've been working on the English discourses. You could do a similar kind of study for the Japanese discourses, and inevitably there will be some variations in how the stories are being told. In my own book that Tom mentioned in the introduction, which came out in 2016, I was trying to position the book in certain dialogues with common discourses, but rather than just repeating common tropes, I wanted to try to expand the thinking of things. So in the process of putting that book together, for example, I did a broad survey of various English language books and the different characteristics of Japanese architecture that came out of them. This is a diagram of some of those key ideas. You can see in the vertical axis some of the key repeating things. And then in writing my own book, tried to set up a series of parallel narratives that trace the evolution of particular aspects through a range of projects and personalities. So the first chapter on international influences and the second chapter on domestic dialogues were deliberately designed as a parallel set to upset the common trope of Japanese architecture being a combination of tradition and modernity. And similarly, the chapter 4 on materiality and chapter 5 were designed in parallel with the ostentation simplicity dichotomy and reinforced by Terunobu Fujimori's notion of red and white schools. So the structure of the book unpacked but also intertwined some of these existing discourses. Within this particular book, I was exemplified here. I was tracing the evolving approaches through a set of representative projects across a set of periods of time. So it's not a comprehensive understanding, but certain threads and lines cut through the history of Japanese to tell a story about the development of Japanese architecture. In the process of crafting this book, I became very interested in architectural photography, and I'm still astounded by the fact that on one page spread, you can have a famous photo by Yasuhiro Ishimoto, which is the one on our left, and it's paired with my much later and much less skilled photograph that are used together to tell a particular kind of story. So this is kind of like a song being sung by a professional singer and a really bad karaoke version all at the same time. But yet we don't often consider the differences in the photographs when we read the page. When we look at this, we just think, oh, that's Kangei's Kagawa Prefectural building. So according to René Magritte, who was a French painter, surrealist painter, this is not a pipe, which is how the French translates. So in that case, then what might this be? Right, this is not a building, this is a photograph of a building. So within the literature on architectural photography, and the literature is not that expansive, following Roland Barthes, Elwald describes and points out and reinforces that audiences too often treat photographs not as if they're buildings, not as their particular interpretations of buildings that might have been made at particular moments, and in many cases by particular people. So part of the arguments that I'm carrying on in the second book are in line with some of these points, and understanding that photographs aren't neutral documents. As Higgett and Ray suggest, the photograph isn't taken, but it's made, and that the camera's subject and viewpoint and framing are those of particular photographers. And at the same time, Elwald reminds us that our experience of the building is often through the complex process of filtering that involves the vision of the photographer and the design skill of the art editor, how it might be laid out and presented to us. But we don't really know that much about the photographers hidden behind the images, who's under the hood. So, for example, and this is a rhetorical question, but if you know the answer, please feel free to chime in. Does anybody know who took any of these photographs?
Maybe one must be by Imag. The middle one.
Yes. So the middle one is Iwan Ban. The first one is Casa Brutus, and then there's my karaoke version. But also, if you look carefully at this photograph, do you notice any key differences in them? Maybe things like power lines that are there in some photos and not in others, or people, or perspective corrections, or different lighting conditions. And in fact, depending on our perspectives, our impressions of the building become quite different. When you go there to try to see it without power lines and with people, all of the openness, and you go there, I don't know if anyone's been there yet, and realize that my photograph is more the actual condition of its current state. But our impression comes from the earlier photographs, much more skilled. So along these same lines, I did another small study, which was to take one building presented by 4 different journals, which were edited by 4 different people and photographed by 4 different photographers, to see what might the stories be. So this is just quickly what GA Japan, all of these magazines came out in the same month, and they were photographed around the same time. I don't think they were photographed on the same day. So this is what how GA Japan presented the project. This is how Kenchiku Bunka presented the project, including a second set of drawings and smaller images. This is how SD presented the project. And this is how Shinkenchiku presented the project. Now, in this brief kind of whirlwind through, you may not notice the differences, but if you step back and abstract and pull out all of the photographs in and of themselves and start to compare them, astoundingly what I discovered is that only the south facade is the only photograph that all 4 photographers took that were used that were even closely similar. Otherwise, everybody's photographs are widely variations. And so these are the exterior photos. These are some of the interior photos. And then there's a whole range of even more divergence of things. So if you look carefully at the spreads, each portrayal focuses on a different aspect and tells a different story about the same building. So GA was celebrating the spatial configurations and set up a kind of mobile viewer. The Kenchiku Bunka was suggesting occupation and kind of narrating particular kinds of experiences within the building. Space design through Anzai's photographs were crafting architectural compositions, and Shinkenchiku was particularly focused on material and light qualities in the project. This is one more example, which also people may pay much attention to. This is our one single building. These are 3 spreads of Tangei's own house, but they were taken by 5 different photographers in 5 different shoots. But yet we read them all together as one version of Tangei's house. This was written by Robin Boyd, an Australian historian and architect. So Tangei was involved in the curation of these projects, but also Boyd was involved in helping choose the photographs and making the presentation. But they're all by different people. So it's not even one story through one voice. It's one kind of collection that starts to tell a story. So within this, I'm trying to make an argument that photographs aren't just neutral records, and they provide certain kinds of evidence for arguments and shaping our understanding. So whereas a professional magazine might be presenting primarily project portraits, in academic books and essays, you can use images as illustrations, but you can also use images to make arguments through. So our photos play a range of discursive roles. So, for example, in another one of the papers that Tom mentioned in the introduction in Architectural Theory Review, I was examining the differences and the collaborations between architectural photographers and architectural historians who were telling stories about wooden architecture and the traditions of Japanese architectural construction. Some of the things that come out of examining the use of photos in magazines and books raise key questions about which images are being used, why are those images, how are they being put together, how are they coordinated with text and images. And just anecdotally, for example, the bottom photo, which actually includes Fujimori in it, one of the authors, in the English version of the book, they published it with Fujimori. In the Japanese version of the book, they published it without Fujimori because they didn't want people to think they could go and sit in the building if they went to visit it. So there are all these kind of subtle shifts in audience and in which images are used where that raise all sorts of questions. Moreover, from the kind of discursive lens, if our imaginations and understanding of Japanese architecture are actually mediated through the publications and texts that circulate around the world, then what critical awareness do we have of, and what kind of engagement do we have with these different media? Now, today we have books and magazines, and then there's a whole world of internet and digital publication and access to images, which expands the conversations even further. So coming out of that, I'm going to shift to introduce my current research and publication on Japanese architectural photography, which is currently titled The Photographic Construction of Japanese Architecture, and it traces about 100 years of developments. Having written the first book from a historical perspective, I wanted to then consider writing the history of Japanese architecture through the photographer's lenses. So this project questions who created the photographs that shape our understanding of Japanese architecture. Why have they produced those kinds of images? What roles do the ecologies of combinations of architect and editor, curator, photographer, and different publication outlets and different exhibition venues and dissemination channels, how do all of those different things play roles in the photographic construction of architecture and the reproduction of the visual culture of Japanese architecture that circulates both locally within Japan and also globally? And then finally, how do the photographers' personalities and their predilections and preferences and their various perspectives ultimately influence our knowledge of the built environment? So the project is aligned with the following key points, with Higgett and Ray, who are arguing that the conception and practice of architecture has been fundamentally altered by the mode of seeing instituted by the camera. This is an argument that's made from basically modern architecture going forward, and an understanding that architecture can be seen to be conceived of, designed, and evaluated almost solely within the framework of the photographic imagery. It's aligned with Zimmerman's contention that photographs are central instruments for architectural communication, architectural commerce, and architectural development, and a kind of essential currency in the global exchange of architecture and architectural ideas. And it's very much addressing Bush's appeal that we look at architecture through the photographer's eyes and examine the ways in which photographs are constructed, because in fact, those photographs are shaping our own ideas and are helping form those constructions. So within the study itself and the publication, I'm placing the work within the historical development of architectural photography in Japan, which begins in the pre-Meiji period. This is actually the first, just before the Meiji period in the late 1850s. This is the first quote-unquote architectural photograph, which was one of the early pieces of photograph equipment that was brought in, which is a Tsurumaru castle, which was in Kagoshima. The Kagoshima daimyo was very interested in modern technology, imported cameras, took photos of his own castle. And then photography of various things progressed over the years, from the documentation of Edo Castle to documentation of imperial buildings and various kinds of imperial buildings, but it really congeals with the introduction of modern architecture and the institution of modern architecture, which is closely aligned with modern photography, both within the Japanese context and also within the global context. The study is also situated within the dramatic post-war increase in media outlets. If you think about in Japan, in various countries around the world, the volume of publications in Japan by the mid 80s, there were over 20, almost 25 journals. And that produced a lot of need for a lot of photographs on a regular basis. So this particular diagram, and I understand you won't be able to see it, the top register tracks the life and death of the span of a range of different key architectural magazines, starting with Kenchiku Jashi, which is the Kenchiku Gakkai outlet, but the first professional magazine was Kenchiku Sekkai, which started in 1907, closely followed by Kenchiku Gaho in 1911. And in the early days, they were including some photography in those publications. And it continues to expand, in particular in the post-war period. For many of those in the room, you probably won't recognize the names of half of these magazines because they don't exist anymore, but they have been very influential in the development of Japanese architecture. And the corollary bottom register are the photographers and various photographers working in various venues and outlets. So as I mentioned, I'm interested in the ecologies that the photographers are operating in. So in this case is trying to understand the networks of which photographers are working in which journals and which journals are being published by which publishers. And then there are, we have the big 5 construction companies. There are also clusters of big 5 publication companies, whether like Kajima Institute Publishing and ADA Edita, Shinkenchiku, that they're kind of conglomerates that the things operate around. And in this particular diagram, trying to understand various relationships with architects. So the width of the line is indicative of the width of the depth of the relationship that the particular photographer had with particular architects. And you can see that some photographers work, some architects work exclusively with one photographer and others work with a whole range of different photographers depending on project and preferences. Within this complicated ecologies, there are also several different kinds of photographers, which I've grouped into those that work for architectural media, which are primarily people who were hired and worked exclusively for magazines. Many of those were freelance photographers either prior to or after working for magazines. And then there's a whole range of photographers that are sometimes invited to shoot architecture from their external perspectives and participate in shooting architecture, but don't do it, let's say, for a living. So the book itself, in its current formulation, in order to trace the evolution of architectural photography and architecture photography and media ecologies, I'm using 9 photographers as a kind of key lens in order to show 100 years of different outputs. And the book is divided into several sections. The context section lays out the intellectual, historical, and media context, which I was just elaborating on. The contributions section introduces a range of key images through which we iconically understand architecture in Japan. And then the contributors section shifts to the key photographers, including their backgrounds and ecologies and various approaches, and it culminates with some considerations. So I will briefly introduce some of the photographers that are included in this study, because they're this shadowy figure that is there, but we don't really know about or don't think about very much. And you've probably seen some of their images, but you might not have seen them or considered their perspectives. So within the story that I'm telling, it starts with Yoshio Watanabe, who is arguably the grandfather of modern architectural photography in Japan. He helped introduce modern portrayals of architecture, collaborating with key architects such as Semi Horiguchi and Kunio Maekawa. Actually, Watanabe's office was in the basement of Maekawa's office, so they had a very close relationship. And the majority of Horiguchi's early work up until about the 50s or into the 60s was shot by Watanabe before shifting to another photographer. But Watanabe is probably most famous for his collaboration with Tange on the Issei book, even though these Issei photos were shot for another purpose prior to the book being done. Again, the kind of complicated world of photography. But Watanabe documented a whole range of iconic historical buildings in various zenshu, and collaborated to connect traditional and modern architectural developments. So Issei Shrine, I think, Tom, your group, we've been looking at the Dento Ronso, and this notion of how you look at old buildings in new ways came through the modern photography being applied to both old and new buildings, which Watanabe was an important player in that process. The next figure is Chuji Hirayama. Hirayama was the Shinkenshku photographer from 1946 till the early 60s and helped shape the way we understand and view Japanese architecture in the public through Shinkenshku. And that set a kind of standard that has been fairly consistent up till today. He also then branched out into some alternative venues and pursuits in the 60s. It follows with Akio Kawasumi, who was one of the first licensed architects to then shift from practicing architecture to become a photographer. He was self-taught, but he opened also one of the first photography offices that was dedicated to specialization in architectural photography for both professional and general audiences. So he was shooting for Kategaho and Modern Living, as well as contributing to Shinkenshku and Kenshku Bunka and other things. And his office, legacy office, still continues today. The next person is a kind of the key person who took a huge volume of photographs for a wide range of people. So Tange Murai was basically Tange's photographer and Shirai's photographer, and he took the first phase or first stage of Shinohara's work, was also documented by Murai, as well as Masako Hayashi's work, and Takanaka Kumaten and Iken Seke, and many others. The next up in the story is, and it's organized chronologically, is Yukio Futagawa, who founded the ADA Editor Company and all of the GA publications that come out of that. You would probably be familiar with some of these. Futagawa was the photographer, the editor, the critic, and a curator through these publications. And arguably, he's a kind of architect of architectural publications, because there are several thousand GA publications when you look at the whole set of outputs, and the majority of the photographs in them were shot by Futagawa himself. The next up is Ohashi, and Ohashi was responsible for a lot of the shift in architecture in the 70s. He took all of Kurokawa's photographs, including the famous photos of Nakagen Capsule Tower, and most of Ito's work until the mid-2010s or so, including the famous model you can see here of Sendai MediaTek. And he was a regular contributor, so in addition to Hasegawa and Riken Yamamoto, and that generation of architects were very heavily documented through Ohashi's eyes and through Kenshku Bunka and Jutaku Kenshku, which he worked for as a freelance photographer. He was also very influential in the transition from 4x5 large format photography to 35mm architectural photography, which also is part of the technological shifts in how things worked. and how we see and what kinds of photographs were possible. I'm also looking at Kiyoshi Takai, who you might not have encountered very often. He was trained by Watanabe, and he worked as a PR photographer for Taisei Corporation, so documenting Taisei's work beginning from the 64 Olympics onwards, and which is when Taisei started Taisei Quarterly, which is a journal to promote their own work and a range of different things. But he also, as a side job and hobby, went around Japan documenting historical vernacular architecture. So there are about 25 books on Minka that Takai produced, as well as books on Kura and Noren and on a whole range of other things. And he also wrote several books on the techniques of architectural photography and was trying to introduce architectural photography practices to people. Complementing Takai is Akisa Masuda. Masuda was also trained by Watanabe and Dokyusei, so the same studied together with Takai. They both wound up working for Taisei, but Masuda has written produced a huge volume of books on Meiji Taisho and early Showa buildings. And so from one perspective, we not only do we understand those buildings through Masuda's lenses, but they live on through Masuda's photographs, because a lot of these buildings are no longer with us anymore. So they're lasting record. He also worked on a number of books with Fujimori sensei, as well as documenting Fujimori sensei's own projects. The majority of the photographs of Fujimori come through Masuda's camera. Then there's Shuji Yamada. Yamada is a kind of outlier photographer who worked for Space Design and the new wave in the 1960s of alternative magazines that were emerging, like Kenchiku and Jutaku and Toshi Jutaku, etc. He collaborated with people like Arati Suzaki and Team Zoo and Hasegawa, and also did an extensive documentation of villages around Japan, which have been documented in several large publications from basically working from the mid-60s to the present. And this is a particular unique and revolutionary early spread of Hara's Keisho kindergarten from SD in 1968, where you see more ground than you do building, and you see the building in its actual occupation, and they basically laid out the 35mm negatives to make out the rest of the spread. So SD was inventing new ways of introducing and showing architecture, in addition to working with a range of different kinds of photographers, and Yamada becomes the example of that. And the last photographer in the group is Mitsumatsu Fujitsuka. And Fujitsuka is actually still practicing, so he's the end of the story, but his story is still continuing. Kengo Kuma, who Fujitsuka has taken many of Kuma's projects. Kengo Kuma earlier described Fujitsuka as the photographer of the architectural nobushi, or the masterless samurai, who were part of the kind of pioneering the pluralist directions from the late 70s onwards. And he's taken many photos for Kuramata Shiro and for Mozuna and Senda and Kengo Kuma and many others, but also very interested in broadening audiences for architecture. So he's worked for modern living and for Kategaho and a whole range of different kinds of projects. So in her master's thesis on Ohashi, Maya Kamon tried to explain the differences between photographers in this particular diagram. And the photographers that I'm studying, noted in yellow, are laid out in this diagram, which sets up a spectrum from sharp to soft and classic to free. Now, that distinction may not matter very much, but I think the main point for me is, like apples, which are laid out here being, sour and sweet. There are many different types and flavors of photographers. One is not necessarily better or worse. They are distinctively different, and they may suit different venues and purposes. But one of the questions is these different flavors of photographers and apples stimulate our palate in different ways and stimulate our imaginations in different ways. So how do the differences in image production from the different kinds of photographers influence our reception of architecture? Also, as I mentioned, I'm interested in how the photographers operate in complex ecologies, coordinating with different architects, editors, publishers, and others. And this is a kind of initial attempt to try to understand the network that Fujitsuka operates in across the different kinds of magazines and the different kinds of editors that he worked with and the different kinds of series that then turn into books, and the kind of slew of work that were done through Toto and the kind of eddies and flows and congealings that happen with different architects and different people. And so this is an effort to understand the complex networks that the photographers operate in. And part of that is because I'm not interested in elevating the photographer as another kind of author. It's like, here's the architect doing things and here's the photographer doing things, but to understand how they work in conjunction with the different roles and outputs and the complex mediation of architecture that shapes how we see and understand the built environment through these things, as well as to raise more awareness of the eyes and lenses that we're actually perceiving things through. So as these quotes describe, and I mentioned earlier, so I'm quite interested in how the discursive constructions through text and image, and following Rosa to think about how photography can become a lens through which a discourse can be formulated to analyze, critique, reassess the evolution of architecture as well as its representation. So in this publication, through the lens of a cross-section of Japanese photographers who specialize in architecture, I'm trying to increase critical awareness of and sensitivity to the roles of images and to the ecologies in framing our knowledge of Japanese architecture as the kind of main goal of the particular project. So by way of wrapping up, I'm just going to end with a few things to consider. The book itself ends in a similar way, not trying to close things down, but to leave it open. So some things to think about. Photographs are not just windows, but they're powerfully actual constructed objects that operate in different ways. So these are Watanabe's photos of Mayakawa's project, and just trying to start to think about, well, where were they taken from, and which books did they go in, and where was the lighting source? Just to start to raise questions about the object nature of the photograph itself, not just the neutral window nature of a photograph. Similarly, photographs circulate and are disseminated in different kinds of venues, and they're used to convey different kinds of information. And in the process of doing this research, these are photographs by Watanabe in Mayakawa's office, and for many years, Mayakawa's office kept track of which images were used in which books. I haven't tracked down how they were used in those books, but I'm sure they were used differently in all of the different venues. One of the other questions to consider is what range of images are used and what range of images do we need to communicate a particular project? So these are Murai's photos of Tange's Saint, I forgot the name of the cathedral, St. Mary's Cathedral in Tokyo. And you can see the photograph as model in the top. You can see the photograph as building in different contexts. You can see it as abstractions. You can see it as occupation. These are all different ways of photographing and presenting buildings, and which are used and why and how. Similarly, how are projects presented in publications? And also which photographs tend to become the kind of hero images and representative of different kinds of projects. So this is just one silly comparison of, this is GA Architect and GA Documents, both photographed by Futagawa, of Isazaki's Disney building, and the different photographs are used in different ways in both publications and are curated in different ways that again tell slightly different stories. So here's the same editor, the same photographer, two different publications and two slightly different variations of what you might think of building. Similarly, what kinds of conditions are buildings presented and photographed in? Famously, architectural photography is normally blue skies, limited clouds, lots of light. But these images by Fujitsuka demonstrate that there are a whole range of different kinds of environmental conditions that you might photograph and consider photographing things in. And then the final couple of points, and then I'll wrap up. So how are lifestyle and use conveyed in photography? Another criticism often of architectural photography is there are no people in them. And this is Ohashi's very first photo of a building for Kenchiku Gumka in 1967. And it has the daughter at the table in the back and the parents watching television in the front. And it was a kind of shocking thing to have in the magazine at the time. And in this particular case, also, this is the Yamagata Dreamland by Kurakawa, and Kurakawa loved this photograph as if you were in the pool and experiencing the building. But conversely, Tange hated this photograph of people outside of St. Mary's Cathedral. So how are lifestyle and use conveyed, and also how is occupation suggested? You don't necessarily have to have people in the building in order to understand or get a sense that it's lived in. Just seeing the kettle on the stove gives you a sense that someone's there, even though they may not necessarily be. And that's part of the way of giving a sense of the life of architecture without necessarily having people in it. Now, I raised this earlier, but this set of comparisons, so this is Murai and Futagawa's images of Tange's Olympic Stadium, and they're taken, each one is taken from a similar perspective, but they have very different characters. So how, in fact, might the differences between photographers matter? We know that they're clearly different, but how might that difference matter? And finally, and slightly philosophically and much more complicated, what is architectural photography anyways? So in this project, I'm following Bush's argument that architectural photography is using photography as a means of conveying information about buildings. I'm rejecting Pardo and Redstone's definition of architectural photography on one hand as being images of the built environment that artists use to craft broader statements about things. And within the literature and within my study of the photographers, there's a very much a tension and an argument that architectural photography is not just shunko shashin that go into magazines. So an understanding that architectural photography is more than just pretty, pristine photographs of recently completed projects that go into magazines and other media to be disseminated around. But that then brings up the question of what is architectural photography anyways, and it's further complicated in my case by the fact that most of the photographers I'm studying don't associate as being architectural photographers, even though they're now in my book on Japanese architectural photography. So I will end with those questions to open it up to questions from Tom and the audience, and thank you for indulging me.
Thank you, Ari. That was fascinating. And beautiful images, of course. For people watching online, that last photograph of the Ando Church really was blurry. That was a wonderful artwork by Hiroshi Sugimoto. So,
yeah, deliberately.
Yes, and really captured a foundly poetic moment. So I was wondering if in studying these decades of architectural photography, you gain some sort of picture of an evolution or a narrative or a a development or a kind of a sense that each generation learns from its previous generation, whether directly in terms of some of the photographers actually being students or apprentices to the previous generation, or simply influenced by what they saw in magazines and other publications, or whether there was a sense that certain photographs might have appeared in print. I can think of images by, for example, Koititaki, which were so powerful that they may have affected in a very kind of immediate way what was then done by the photographers who'd seen those images, and it changed the way they worked. So is there a sense of a kind of an overall progression or evolution, or is it just kind of a series of vignettes of individual photographers?
It's primarily a series of vignettes, but there are some connections in. So because I'm looking at the photographers in their ecologies, I'm looking also at who they studied with and who they worked with, and those produce different kinds of intersections in different ways. So there are some photographers for which you can see the lineage of influence more directly, and there are others where it's sometimes indirect. And in the course of studying, when I had access to photographers, I would ask them who they were influenced by, and in many cases they would pick external sources, not the previous generations of architects they were working with, but also certainly, for example, in the 60s, and Take is part of this, the blurry photography period. There's an automatopoeia for it, which I'm now escapes me. But that movement of a high contrast photographs rippled through and into architectural photography, partially through Take and Provoke, but also through other avenues. And it was picked up by people like Yamada, but Yamada was already doing very high contrast photographs prior to that. And so this was a kind of a nudge in a particular direction in his own work. I think also in conversations that I've had, for example, Murai was quite influenced by those photographs, and he's having taken Shinohara's photographs for many years, was also, from what I've understood through conversations, was inspired to think in a slightly different way after seeing those photographs. So there are networks of influences, but there's not a direct linear evolution through any of it.
Okay, that's fascinating. Thank you. Do we have any questions from the audience in the room right now?
Yes. One question.
Yep.
Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation also about this book about constructing image of Japanese architect. I wonder if your book can also deconstruct the image of Japanese architect. The reason why I'm asking is because there's a certain like and dislike of photos, and there's a sort of editing process. So, for example, photographers have taken lots of photos, and eventually some of the photos are selected by architect or the editors. So there are lots of photos that are unused. Yeah. And I wonder, earlier you explained me about visiting those photographers for their archive. Yeah. And once you discover this archive, there are many different types of photo of particular building. Then one of the contribution of this book to me is about also looking at the building in a very alternative vantage point, because the building we know in the books are already like this image. But if you look at all those alternative images, maybe we have different way of conceiving Japanese architecture. Yeah.
I think that you're right, and part of the interest in discourse and raising critical awareness of how photographs are used to construct discourse and to construct our understanding is a deconstruction of our understanding. So I think that intellectually underlying the process of exposing the lenses and perspectives that we're using is part of a kind of deconstruction process. But the archives of which photos are used is also a very fascinating project. I've run into cases, for example, where I want to use a particular photograph and I ask the architect about it and I say, I don't like that photograph. But I'm not choosing photographs because the architect likes them or choosing the photographs for the building necessarily. I'm choosing the photographs that represent the photographer's point of view and how they were to give a kind of example of their perspectives. And so the building content, in my case, the building content matters less. It's how it's representative of the photographer's work matters more. So I'm pulling things out of the archive that aren't necessarily the famous building that's on the cover. So for example, Ohashi's photo of Sendai MediaTek model, which is the most, everybody have seen that image at one time or another, but many people haven't seen Ohashi's photographs of the finished building. Anybody else?
I can have a question. We start the presentation with a quotation from Roland Barthes, right? And I think my question would be, for example, if of course, there is a perspective of the photographer, and there is a perspective of the architect that selects a photography that he wants to publish, or he wants to show to the world, let's say. But then there is a perspective of the viewer. For example, if I see photographs of a building that I've never been to, that photograph is the only thing that is informing me. If I don't read any plans, that photograph is the only thing that is informing me of the shape or the spatial quality of the building. If the photographies, for example, are only shown in the kind of abstract way, like some photographers take, like some angles that only we can see the light coming through some void space or something like that, my image of the building or the construction I have of that image in my head is completely different of the reality of can be sometimes completely different from the reality of the building. Yeah. So I wonder if it can be a perspective of the photographer or the architect to kind of create the death of the author in a sense that it's trying to communicate a building that doesn't exist through the photography that he takes.
Within the photography literature, and there's an argument by John Daniell, I think it was probably in the 70s, that architectural photography lies. Daniell was a photographer, I think, for Architectural Review in the UK. So there's an article about architecture lies. And actually, Futagawa adheres to that, to a similar kind of line. But what they're talking about is not that the photography is some kind of deliberate distortion of truth, but that the photography of a building and the actual experience of a building are two separate things. So the photography captures through certain kinds of lenses, through certain kinds of positions, in certain kinds of lighting conditions. You go there in person. Some of those positions you can actually occupy, some of them you can't. But that there's a distinction being made between the building and the experience of a building and the photograph as a representation of the building. And in some cases, photographs as representations used as invitations to come and visit the building, but then also becoming congealed as historical records of the project itself. On one hand. On the other hand, within the practices of architectural photography, there are some photographers that will sit down with the architect and have the architect explain the project and follow the ambitions of the architect who says, I really want that moment, or this is a key axis, or whatever. And there's some photographers that don't talk to the architects and don't want to talk to the architects. They just go and they present their experience and the things that interested them when they were there. When we look at the photographs, we don't know which one was informed by the architect and which one was an independent operator. hopefully my book will give us some sense of who operated in different ways, but we don't know. And so part of Elwall's point, building on Barth's earlier work on photography, is that we just assume that it's the thing. But it's not the thing, and there are all of these complex filtering layers of how we understand the thing, and that's what this book is trying to make a broader awareness of some of those layers that shape our understanding. But they all operate at the same, all of the things you're saying, they all operate at the same time, so it's hard to actually piece them out.
Sure. Thank you.
For example, Futagawa is famous for going to shoot buildings and not telling the architects. Just turning up on site and taking photos and then calling the architects later and giving his opinion of the project. And also, whereas in Shinkenchiku and Kenchikubuka and others, the editors would show the architect the spread, Futagawa never showed anybody anything until it came out in print. So he didn't, so those are just an example of the relationship different relationships between architect and photographer and editors within this small set of 9 people.
Hold on, I have a question. How does this consciousness of creating new good photographs for architects shape the architect's design? Like, how this design of architects changed before the photograph, technology appeared? Is there any difference before the photograph age and after the photograph age? I mean, the architectural design.
In much earlier moments, we hand drew perspectives. And in the early days of photography in the 20s and modern architecture period, we were still drawing axisymmetrics and perspectives, and often the photograph was used to confirm the image in the perspective. Prior to that, you probably only had drawings. There were drawings to produce the building, and there were drawings of the thing that was produced that then reinforced each other.
Yeah, after the appearance of the photograph technology, maybe architects are going to deliberately to make strange shapes or to make the image, to make the building more, exaggerated or image producing. Is that true?
Yeah, in some cases, and that's one of the quotes I was using by Higgin and Ray, this notion that we design architecture for its photography as much as we design architecture for its occupation, because you want to get good photographs of the thing that then disseminate, that can give you kind of promotion and bring more work and various things. But there's also another aspect to it. So, for example, Shinohara is famous for staging and being very hands-on in the photography of his work, but the majority of his work are small houses. And he had he contracted basically for like a 2-week or a period of time before the owner came in, that he could capture and photograph the building in the image of the architect before the client moved in and lived in the building in their image and in their way. And those photographs, he was very hands-on, because those photographs then were representative of his ideas, and that's what circulated, and that's what went around to understand what he was aiming for. So various architects are very involved in it, but in Shinohara's case, for example, unless he took the photographs at the beginning before the client got there, he wouldn't be able to capture the architect's image of the house. In my case, what I'm saying is the architect's image of the house is through Murai's lens, is through Ohashi. So it's Ohashi's version of what Shinohara wanted, or Murai's version of what Shinohara wanted, or Kojitake's version of what he found in Shinohara's projects, which were then often complemented by another photographer that congealed Shinohara's image, which also just complicates the world of photography.
Thank you.
How complicit are those photographers in terms of capturing perfect image?
It depends on the personalities and their relationships with each other, the degrees of complicity and the degrees of cooperation. So, for example, in Futagawa's case, he was independently operating. In Murai's case, with Shidai and Murai would be on site talking to each other as they went around and took the photographs. With Tange, Murai, it was like a competition. Murai would take the photos, or Tange would like map out where he wanted photos, and Murai would try to get the best angle, and then found out actually that was where Tange set up to take the photo from anyways. So there was a kind of friendly competition to get the best angles between the architect and the photographer, although Tange was a photographer himself and very interested in photography. So all of the different architects and different relationships, each one had a different kind of relationship with different people, which is also part of the complexity of the ecologies that I'm trying to bring out or look at and bring out.
I'm sure architect wants to be famous. Then you ask the photographer to take photo to make them famous in a way. So are they also is a photographer complicit in terms of creating this heroic image, or creating some kind of star architect image, or to make them even famous around the world? Because photography fly around the world and people see it. So.
Yeah. From one perspective, architects are service providers. A client comes, asks you to make them a house, make them a church, make them a school, and the architect provides them. Photographers are also service providers. The architects and magazines come to them and say, I need good photos of this project. Take me good photos of this project. It also happens in art as well, or in food or fashion. The fashion designer designs the clothes, the photographer takes the clothes go in the magazine, and the photographer and the clothes go onto a runway. Eventually they get to a store. So from that perspective, a photographer as service provider are definitely complicit in those processes. And that's why I think of it as collaboration, like in the same way that the structural engineer supports the architect in making the building stand up, the photographer works with the architect to make images of the building that can circulate and spread information and understanding and records of the building going forward. But whether they're aiming for fame or not is not always the case.
What are the contributions of architectural photographer in terms of fertilizing architectural creativity or even good design, giving younger architects to be famous and get more commissions? And because eventually you have good photo, and if it's a good ecology, then architects get to have more chance to produce interesting architectural work and good projects.
The different photographers have different ambitions for how they stimulate architecture itself. So Kawasumi was an architect. He shifted to photography. He wanted to support architecture. Futagawa was using photographs and books to improve understanding of architecture generally. Fujitsuka is taking photographs and trying to disseminate them to raise general interest in architecture in order to raise the quality of architecture. And also from another direction, the editors will often ask photographers to recommend buildings because the photographers are hired by the architect hires photographer, photographer takes building, editor asks photographer, have you taken in, what are the good buildings I should be looking at? So there's a network of information that comes around, and they work together in different ways. So the photographers aren't tastemakers. The editors are more the tastemaker and the control of the public, and the curators and the control of the information. But the photographers are valuable because they're producing the media that's being disseminated in the images that we understand things through. So they're complicit, but they're not that's not their ambition necessarily. Who thinks they'll look at photographs differently now? Yeah.
I have a question. Most of those photographers took also pictures of buildings in foreign countries. So, is there any discourse from them about any differences in their work between those two conditions?
In terms of photographers from one country taking photos of buildings in another country? I'm not sure. I think that the individual modes of taking photographs of various people matter more than the country or the culture that they come from. The actual camera equipment that everybody's using is similar. So this is probably not the right analogy, but say painters are all using paintbrush and acrylic paints. So the mediums are similar, but so the difference if you're a French painter or a Japanese painter or a Brazilian painter, they may matter, but they may not matter as much. The cultural difference may not matter as much, but there are particular ways of seeing that might come through. So, some photos in Japanese, for example, like ukiyo paintings and woodblock prints, there's a kind of layering of space. In Japanese traditional buildings, there's a kind of layering of rooms, and some of that carries through to how photographers conceive of and photograph layering of space. But that's not exclusive to this country necessarily. So it would be hard to pin it down to cultural differences or national differences. There would be differences, but I think it's probably more by person than by country. And also photographs circulate around the world. So magazines come into Japan, magazines from Japan go out. So people are looking at the image culture around. Now we look at, we Google search something, we get images from all over. So that also brings things more together, potentially.
Important exhibitions about architectural photographs?
There are very few. There was one at the Tokyo Teian Museum about 15 years ago. And there was one at the Tokyo Photography Museum about, 5 or 6 years ago. The Teian Museum traces the history of photography and has been very influential in helping me set up the history. The Tokyo Photography Museum was basically taking things out of their collection and highlighting a series of people that they had on in the collection. In Japan, in the UK, the Reba Archive. So the Elwall quotes come out of Elwall's book called Building Light, which is the history of photographers through the Reba collection. And there are a couple of books on Spanish modernism, because there's at one of the universities, there's a group led by Inaki Bergera who are looking at modern photographers in Spain and their representations of modern buildings. And they've done some exhibitions in conjunction with that. But beyond those, it's very limited space. There were some exhibitions by called Shooting Space is one of the catalogs of built environment photography, but that's, I think, slightly different than the architectural photography that I'm looking at. But this space has some literature, but not a lot. So kind of media studies in architecture of publications and books and magazines and films and photography is still, I think, in quite early stages. If anyone needs a research topic, there's still lots of space in that field.
The examples you use are mostly fairly old, up until, let's say, the end of the last century. And increasingly in recent years, there's a shift in architecture to a great deal of transparency and reflectivity, which is a practical challenge for photography in terms of not making sure the reflection of the photographer is not in the image.
Sure.
But also the architecture itself gets a kind of photographic quality. And I remember there was an interview with Sejima and Nishizawa where they explicitly said, when we're designing, we're thinking about possible photographs of the way the building will look. And I'm also reminded of the writings of Kingo Kuma, where he criticizes very clearly photogenic architecture, yet has produced some of the most photogenic architecture and recognizable photographs of Japanese architecture in recent memory. So whether or not the architects are influenced by the photographs, as has been suggested, certainly the type of architecture that's being produced raises new challenges for photography.
In some cases, yes. Yep. So how you represent certain kinds of things, certainly, and in some cases those are welcome challenges because it's a new kind of thing to figure out how to do. We don't just taking a square building, we have a complex curve and it's metallic, and how do we deal with that? So yeah, I think they're kind of hand in hand. There's also, and it only comes at the tail end of this story because the transformation to digital photography has really only happened in the last 12 years. Most of the shift was around 2007, 2008. So the world that's been expanded through digital photography, in addition to the world of different kinds of buildings, objects that have been made possible, are also working hand in hand. And the fact that now we carry phones in our pocket and there's 1 million photos of every building, and half of them are mirroring the image that came out in the magazine or on the main blog that you happen to look at. There's a kind of repetition of images on one hand and an exciting proliferation of everyone being able to take whatever they want. I just encourage you to take an extra minute to frame your photo before you snap it, because it makes all the difference.
That's a good place to end.
Yep.
Thank you very much, Ari. That was
Thank
a
you.
fantastic presentation. And thank you all for coming.